John's contribution to the field of transport and its relationship with risk assessment, I think, is phenomenally important. And his link of transport to environmental issues, climate change, I think, similarly so. And so I won't listen to him. I will say a few things about his background. His research interests include climate change, risk assessment, and compensation in transportation. He was a member of the original board of directors of Friends of the Earth in the early 1970s, and has been involved in debates about environmental issues ever since, particularly with regard to transportation. His interest in risk has broadened from its original focus on threats to the environment to a wide range of other contexts, such as transportation financial aspects, and has resulted in the development of generic framing devices for dealing with risk. His seminal book, Risk, is an analysis of how humans access and respond to perceived risks. I would have to say that he and Erlich Beck, who has also similarly written in this field, have a lot to say about the context, the power of context, and how risk needs to be re-examined as context for transportation projects develop. John was a member of the RSA Risk and Conflict Commission, and in 2006 he was elected honorary member of the Institute of Risk Management. So over to you, John. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Harry, for inviting me out of retirement to write one of my favorite hobbies. This is my title, and more specifically what I want to talk about is the social costs of moving about too much. It seems to me that the benefits of moving about are very well advertised. I want to examine the idea implicit in the prospectuses of both Megaprojects that these benefits accrue without limit. So for my text, I want to take one of my favorite quotations from Kenneth Baldwin. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or a con. And I want to explore the dangers of leaving planning in the hands of this coalition. Well, here is the cover of the Megaproject executive summary. It asks what constitutes a successful megatransport project in the light of increasing risks and uncertainties that the future poses. And it's clear that they're not sticking to a conventional project analysis defined by the Eigen triangle. Is it on time, on budget, and does it meet the project specifications? In judging the success of the project, the report considers interrelated concepts of economic sustainability, social sustainability, and institutional sustainability. Sustainability. Well, there appears to be a lack of clear and shared vision of the meaning of sustainable development, threatens to seriously undermine the potential for the use of megatransport projects to make a positive contribution to its achievement. Many so-called MPPs are not projects at all, but programs of projects. Sometimes programs with mega projects. Meta projects can be very significant and very significant change. So I want to examine the meta transport project. A set of ideas, convictions that underpin all the others. The policy or the project of governments everywhere to promote more mobility without apparent end, or without the ability to recognize when the end might be approaching. I'll offer an example from one government of this country. That's a graph showing, going back to 1950, showing what has happened to just in time. The bottom sliver is cycling. Walking doesn't appear there at all because going back to the 50s we didn't have the statistics. cycling has almost disappeared into the bottom axis. Buses declining, rail up until the period of this graph is drawn first in the late 90s, and then the explosive growth of car travel and even more explosive growth of travel by air. In Britain, in 1950, the average Briton traveled 5 miles a day. When I produced this graph in 2005, it was 30 miles a day and forecast to be 60 miles a day by 2025. Now, if you project back into history, you have a condition which I call hypermobility. That's the pedestrian peasant village, and I think none of us will ever live there. For most of my lifetime, or up until I would say the early 70s rather, that rising graph and the trends in it were almost unanimously labeled progress. That middle arrow indicates the 73 energy crisis. And since the early 70s, more and more people have been attaching a question mark to progress. And finally, off the top of the page, we have the hypermobile society, which I think most people would concede, other than the Magnum and the economists, represents a society with too much mobility. Well, I want to start with the progress phase. In 1937, a year before I was born, the National Association of Manufacturers, in order to cheer people up in the recession, covered the United States with that poster. The message seeped across the border into, as far as Toronto, where I was born, and that's the world in which I grew up. My father had a hat like that. We had a car. I had an older sister, and we had a dog. The only thing wrong with that is we have a Labrador Retriever. So that's the vision that has inspired. Well, certainly it inspired this Megaproject, the interstate highway system, which at the time was described as the largest public works program since the pyramids. I'll come back to the pyramids toward the end, but physically, it's showing signs of unsustainability. It's got growing numbers of potholes, bridges that need reconstructing or reinforcing. But I want to talk about the social implications of the trends that justified building a project such as that. What societal transformations accompany those trends? Well, to begin with, society becomes more polarized. As the average number of miles traveled per Briton per day increased, so did the variance. Those who didn't have cars got left behind. The world ran away to the suburbs and out-of-town shopping malls, and the lives of people without cars, they depended for their mobility on either became second-class citizens, depended for their mobility on the goodwill of car owners or bundling public transport service. It became more anonymous and less convivial. This comes from Donald Appleyard's Livable Streets, done in 1981. It's been replicated on a number of occasions since, and what it shows is on the bottom streets with heavy traffic, heavy vehicular traffic, don't have many people crossing the streets. They don't have many friends or acquaintances on the other side of the street. The large amount of spaghetti in the middle of the road at the top, that's a lightly trafficked street, and in streets like that, people tend to know far more of their neighbors. As the number of neighbors people know diminishes, more and more we lived surrounded by strangers, and in the 70s and 80s, campaigns like Stranger Danger increased in popularity, ran in school, appeared on milk cartons, and it became physically more dangerous, more metal in motion. And this had profound consequences, especially for children. In 1971, a fellow named Mayor Hillman did a study of 5 schools in England, Islington, suburban Nottingham, Chipping Norton, Winchester, I forget the other one, and 80% of 7- and 8-year-old children got to school on their own and accompanied by an adult. I joined him in 1990, we visited the same schools, and only 9% got to school on their own, unaccompanied by an adult. And when we asked their parents why, the 2 main reasons, stranger danger and fear of traffic. And now, the study has been repeated again 20 years on, and virtually no children of that age are allowed to get to school on their own unaccompanied. And in fact, there was a case that made the newspapers a year and a half ago. The Schonrucks wanted to allow their children to cycle to school, and the school threatened them with the social services. They were irresponsible parents for allowing their children to cycle 5 miles to school through quiet streets and one busy crossing that had traffic lights and a lollipop lady to see them across. So that is one, I think, well-documented illustration of what too much motorized mobility has done to the lives of our children. Just moving quickly on, we have what I call the culture effect. The only way you could tell you were leaving one community and entering another was when the franchises started repeating and you spotted another 7-Eleven, another Wendy's, another Costco, another Home Depot. That's from describing a journey through suburban Oakland by Tom Wolfe. This problem now well acknowledged from a study by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. Decades of uncontrolled suburban sprawl perceived around the motor car are left them unable to walk even if they wish to. And crime and fear of crime. Crime apparently has peaked and is now going down, but fear of crime has not. More and more surveillance becomes Orwellian. I'm on a committee looking at cybersecurity, and I've been to a number of conferences discussing the problems of cybersecurity, and Big Brother is frequently alluded to. It has effects on democracy. As we travel further and further in our daily round, we cross more and more traditional authority boundaries. And unless the scale of government expands to cover the area of our routine travel, then local government becomes impotent. So power, authority, responsibility, accountability migrate upward from Town Hall to Whitehall to Brussels to completely undemocratic organizations like the World Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so on. I had the interesting experience a few years ago of being invited to speak to a conference of science fiction writers. And I asked if anyone could give me an example from the genre of science fiction in which distance had been conquered by science and technology of a working democracy. And nobody could. From Brave New World to 1984 to Blade Runner, the form of government was tyrannical hierarchy. The scale of problems that needed governing was too grand to be accomplished by anything that we might recognize as a working democracy. Finally, I don't want to ignore the explosive growth in electronic mobility, which has been heralded as a way of limiting the amount of physical mobility needed. Its contribution has been disappointing, to say the least. In many ways, it has stimulated more physical travel. A while back, I was in Vancouver Airport waiting to fly to London, and got speaking to the fellow waiting next to me, and he was going to Toronto to play bridge with somebody from San Francisco, somebody from Edinburgh, and somebody from Toronto. They had met and played bridge on the internet, and now they needed a real game. This form of communication means that more and more we are living a growing proportion of our lives in aspatial communities of interest, which means that we're surrounded more and more by strangers, billions of strangers now, not just the strangers in our neighborhood walking down the street. Online, the default mentality is paranoia. Yesterday I had 23 spams. Probably lots of people email spams. And on my website, the number of spam comments greatly exceeds the number of comments that have anything sensible to say about what I put up on my website. So this is a growing problem, and one that is driven by the forecasts that Peter Hall was referring to. The forecasts are routinely bad. Here's a graph drawn by Philip Goodwin, who many of you will know. The top one is the 1989 high forecast, and high is sometimes also called optimistic. And despite the fact that since the late 1980s, the forecasts have consistently disappointed, still the most recent ones anticipate yet further growth. Now, how can this be? Well, the same thing is happening with air forecasts. Even though they've turned down, the forecasters see them continually rising. Now, perhaps this is just a local European developed world problem. What is happening worldwide to the growth in car ownership? Well, that was produced that in 1995. That's the world car population. And since then, the so-called developing world has overtaken the world leader in terms of car production annually. Let's go back to this graph. Just under 500 billion in the mid-90s. It's now just touched 1 billion cars in the world. Well, you can redraw this graph, and the bottom slice on the right-hand graph is the left-hand graph on a different scale. So we have people with cars and people without cars. In 1950, there were about 2.5 billion people in the world who did not own cars. In 1995, there were about 5 billion people in the world who did not own cars. And now there are about 6 billion people in the world who do not own cars. So the idea of pursuing a car-owning democracy appears to be receding. Let's go back to going back to the vision which I drew up. I might ask delighted with that photograph because it was a photograph that appeared in Life magazine in 1937. It has achieved iconic status because here's the full picture. People queuing for food relief with the Louisville, Kentucky. So, returning to this idea of the social consequences of ever-increasing mobility, here's a graph from a book that I found absolutely fascinating by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, showing the rise and then steep fall from about 1960, it peaked in the 60s and 70s, and then started falling dramatically in membership in league bowling. And in his book, he uses a huge number of other indicators of communality, membership in Rotary clubs, parent-teachers associations, the amount of hitchhiking people do, the Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, a whole range of measures of people in spatial communities, distinct from aspatial ones, managing to get together and do things communally. So here we have our graph, and as I've already said, since the early 70s, since Ken Livingstone got punched in the jaw at the Archway Road inquiry in northwest London, more and more people have been attaching a question mark to this pursuit of ever more mobility. And it has been since the 70s, early 70s, it has been accompanied by a huge growth in inequality. Is there a connection? Well, I don't want to be deterministic about this because it's not just to do with transport. Those two vertical bars happen to coincide with the reign of Margaret Thatcher. So, going back to the pyramids. This is a fascinating book that I've only recently come upon, published in 1974. A critical stage for the maintenance of the working force was reached with limitation of access. Oh, sorry, the riddle I should say to begin with is why were pyramids or tombs for pharaohs? Why should there be more tombs, more pyramids than there were pharaohs? The critical stage for the maintenance of the working force was reached when limitations of access to the pyramid demanded its reduction. When the pyramid neared completion, the entire workforce was no longer needed. At this stage, there was only one way out of the economic dilemma, which is clearly immediate and massive unemployment, resulting in what we now know as an economic recession. The surplus workers had to be shifted to the start of the next pyramids. From then on, not one but two pyramids were under construction. Once it was realized that the main object of pyramid construction was a work program leading to a new social order, the religious meaning and ritual importance of the pyramids recede into the background. Well, in the current austerity, infrastructure development is one of the principal arguments for yet ever increasing numbers of mega projects, which will hopefully create jobs and get us out of the recession. Well, the forecasts that have been repeatedly defied by a slower growth than forecast can be explained by this long and persistent correlation between GDP and a variety of measures of mobility. All of those growth forecasts, why were they keeping going on up? Because the principal ingredient of almost all transport and traffic forecasts of which I'm aware is GDP. And the forecasters are not permitted by their political masters to feed the forecasts with anything other than wildly, they would call optimistic forecasts of GDP, which then translate into more traffic. Well, here is Boeing's cheerful forecast. You can see that dip post 2008, 2007, and yet rising on and on. Growth in air travel measured in revenue passengers has historically outpaced economic growth, represented by GDP, by approximately 1.5 to 2%. And these forecasts assume that that will continue, and therefore justify building ever-increasing numbers of airports. You can see that the European North American share of that traffic is diminishing, but still growing in absolute numbers. Revenue passenger kilometers are projected to increase by a factor of 6 from their 1990 values. So that's assuming an annual forecast of traffic growth of 5.3% per year, which means that they're feeding their forecasting model with GDP forecasts of 3.3 to 3.8% per year. And there's a growing school amongst some economists that that's not enough. That in order to get the economy pumping along as it really should be, we have to get up to 4% and then feed our transport model presumably with that number. So back to my original text. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world as an economist, it's a problem that Keynes worried about. Inconclusively, this is from his 1930 essays, 1930 essay about the economic, called economic probabilities or possibilities for our grandchildren. He was impressed by the force of compound interest. It couldn't go on forever. And at some point we would have to act on it. And it would be wonderful. I see us free, therefore, to return to some of the most sure and certain principles of religion and traditional virtue. If avarice is a vice, etc., we shall honor those who can teach us how to pluck the hour in the day virtuously and well. Delightful people who are capable of taking direct enjoyment in things. The lilies of the field toil not, neither do they spin. Well, in 1930, Keynes said, but beware, time for all this is not yet. So, I conclude with a question. If not yet, when? Thank you.